Buenas tardes. Hola.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this press conference after the informal meeting of the Ministers of Justice of the EU. It has just concluded here in Logroño. The Minister for Justice, Pilar Llop, will take the floor, followed by the Commissioner, Didier Reynders. After the interventions, in the order described, there'll be a round of questions. Please identify who you are and whom you represent when you ask your question. Now, given where we are, and since the minister is here not as a minister, but as the rotating chair of the EU, therefore, please, no domestic questions will be answered. So, the Minister for Justice has the floor. Pilar Llop. Good afternoon again. First of all, I'd like to thank all concerned for being here and also greet those who are following us remotely. I'd also like to thank the local and regional authorities for their help in hosting this event and the effort thanks to which these days have been possible for Council of Ministers to meet informally. We've been able to do so in the best possible conditions, also thanks to our security forces. And I'd like to thank them and pay tribute to them and to all those who played a role in making all this possible. I'd also like to thank the citizens of Logroño for hosting us and being patient with the disruption. My European colleagues also deserved thanks from me because they've shown a spirit of compromise and availability, and likewise Commissioner Reynders, not only today but also for his efforts, and the MEP who were present for the relevant parliamentary committees, and also the different community agencies who played their part. I'd also like to pay tribute to all the backroom staff who work behind the scenes to make this presidency a possibility. It was an honor for me to chair this meeting, particularly at a decisive moment like the one Europe is living through now, particularly because it's in the final home straight of some aspects of the European legislature. One of our priorities, as you know, as presidency, is to bring citizens closer to the EU. I think we've managed to do that in a number of ways. First of all, because, as I said, we're meeting here in Logroño, in order to bring the European institutions closer to citizens. The institutions often run Europe, the citizens need to be able to see them. Coming to the capital of Rioja, from the point of view of my ministry and the cooperation with the EU authority, it's also relevant because we recently launched an exhibition on how citizens are affected by EU rules here in Logroño, and how citizens are affected, and you can visit that. And Javier Marca, the President of the Supreme Court, very much helped in organizing this exhibition, which I invite you all to visit. The other reason I'd like to highlight is that today we're talking about things about justice and people, the access of citizens to justice. This is a fundamental right of citizens, and it's part of the citizen-centered approach, particularly for people with vulnerabilities. And there are particular aspects I'd like to stress. We talked about accessibility of justice, the rights of victims, and combating organized crime. In line with bringing Europe closer to Europeans, all of us are directly affected by what happens at the European level. And bearing that in mind, today's working sessions, the first in particular, was focused on, as I said, person-centered, people-centered justice. So the ministers tried to see how we can render justice more accessible to our citizens, which is a key to the rule of law. One of the main barriers is a physical barrier when it comes to access to law, just infrastructure. Infrastructure has to protect people, has to be welcoming for people, has to make it possible for people to access their human rights. We talked about proposals to erode barriers that make it harder for people with disabilities to access justice. We shared experience. We, of course, come from different countries, whether it's signing, whether it's digital tools, whether it's physical and other barriers, economic vulnerabilities, all of these things which can be a problem when you're trying to access justice. Free legal aid, another important guarantee, that was discussed. And from the administrative point of view, there's the complexity of legal language, which can be opaque. We've talked about how we can have the right legal standards and safeguards, but make it accessible to all, understandable to all, including people with disabilities. We try to talk about modernizing the legal system and legal language and making it clearer. We're all entitled to justice, but we're all entitled to access to justice and to understanding what's going on in the process. As part of this, my fellow ministers and heads of delegation pooled ideas from their respective countries and tried to see how we can work together to have a better response, a more effective answer to the problems I've been describing. Social cohesion, territorial cohesion are important in the EU. As part of that, everyone has to be able to have access, regardless of the situation, regardless of where they are in the EU, wherever they are, they have to have the same access to justice, as I've said. The second discussion we had was about the rights of victims. That's another important point, the rights and protection for victims. This informal exchange of views between ministers enabled us to discuss means of better protection for victims, how to answer the needs of victims of crime. We all agree that this area of peace, security and justice cannot be viewed as complete if we don't protect victims. It's not just about repression of crime, it's about a proper response to the victims from all the levels of institutional activity. They have to be able to establish their rights and know their rights. Since 2001, this has been on the agenda, and Spain has always supported the process. In 2012, there was a directive, and since then, sectorial texts have topped it up with regard, for instance, to particular needs for particular types of crime or victim. Of course, we need more. On the 11th of June, a Commission proposal was made, and a new initiative seeks to strengthen victims' rights across the EU for damages, for information, and so on. The existing directive needs to be updated with basic rules going further than what we had in 2012, because our societies have evolved, our needs have evolved, and new technology, the whole legal service, they're all in a state of flux. And indeed, Commissioner Reynders made some very cogent points about that. We exchanged points of view on harmonization, for instance, on a renewed general regime to protect and provide guarantees in some areas, particular sectors, particular types of crime, particular specific types of victims, people who have particular needs, who need help. We're talking about gender violence, about minors, terrorism, or gender-based violence. Citizen-focused justice must allow citizens to know their rights, that they can have access to everything that we can avoid secondary victimization, and so that everyone knows what the proper way and pathways to restoration, damages, and compensation is. We also need equal access, but non-discriminatory access and care for victims. The victims of the Russian war against Ukraine are all over Europe. This has created new needs in our duty of care for victims. A joint investigation team or teams have been set up with that in mind, and the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine has been set up. The aim of all this is to protect victims in every way. More than 16,000 children have been taken illegally to Russia, and indeed an international criminal process has been started as a result of this. Eurojust has taken steps to create national centers for collecting evidence. This will be further passed on to the relevant authorities, including the International Criminal Court and to The Hague more specifically. And of course, there's full support to the prosecutors from us, from the Commission, for investigations as to what's happening in Ukraine, also to provide economic support to the relevant places. Psychological support for victims is necessary as well, including to these victims. We must stand firm at every level against the Russian Federation, and sanctions that have been imposed must be followed, given the terrible damage to the victims of war caused by this illegal war of aggression. I'd also like to finally say something about our very last session, which was about how we answer the challenge from organized crime and the threat organized crime represents to everyone. It's an international cross-border issue for all of our countries, and it's a problem based on the use of new technologies by organized crime to escape justice. We have discussed our respective positions on a number of aspects we can agree on, such as tackling the funding of crime, the hiding of assets arising from crime, the profits of crime, and so on. Cryptocurrencies and crypto assets are a big part of this. This is new technology. This is very digitalized. It's hard to trace. It's very hard to monitor or to keep track of the flows. It's therefore difficult for our enforcement agencies to have preventive and administrative oversight and to act in due time. Much is available and much has been done, but we need to go on thinking about this. Some of it involves bodies outside the EU, and we have to see how we can be more effective in combating organized crime. We've looked at different institutional aspects and multi-stakeholder aspects, including the private sector, that are relevant to this. Much of the private sector's role can add value to our efforts. There are some sectors in the private sector that by their very characteristics are closely tied in to certain types of criminal activity, or can be very useful to combating and investigating such crimes. Their cooperation is invaluable. But we need to examine how we can make such cooperation more available, whether you're talking about transport, land transport, maritime, but also media and IT services. So it's been a long, fruitful day, exchanging a lot of interesting views, and perhaps I could say a little bit more finally regarding our concern about the war in Ukraine and the crimes being perpetrated there, which is something we're fully committed to going on combating. Finally, I'd like to thank all my colleagues yet again for their efforts, their cooperation, their positive input, and I very much hope, and indeed I am sure, that what we talked about today will lead on naturally to further steps, including during our own presidency. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. And now I'll give the floor to Commissioner Reynders.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in Logroño for this informal meeting of Justice Affairs. And let me thank first the Minister Llop, the Pilar, and the Presidency for facilitating our very productive exchange today. We'll have a very busy agenda over the next 6 months, and I'm looking forward to continuing our cooperation in the same spirit as today. Firstly, on our work to protect and empower victims of crime, today was our first opportunity to discuss with the Member States the revision to the Victims' Rights Directive that the Commission proposed earlier this month. And our aim is to ensure that victims of crime can fully rely on their rights, regardless of the circumstances of the crime or where it took place in the EU, so for all types of crimes. In the years since the original directive, our understanding of child-friendly and victim-centered justice evolved, and so too has the technology available to us to achieve it. As I outlined today to ministers, our evaluation identified gaps in the existing framework. The measures we have proposed to address them will ensure victims can benefit from these advances as soon as possible. For example, we have proposed to make the victims' helplines that exist in some Member States mandatory across the European Union. We want to help victims to participate more actively in criminal proceedings, securing them proper support and guaranteeing their right to challenge decisions that affect their rights. And we want to ensure that victims can access the compensation they deserve from those who perpetrate crime. We also need to ensure the most vulnerable victims are taken care of and that they can access support that meets their specific needs. This begins with an improved individual assessment to establish exactly what those needs are. The most vulnerable victims should then be able to rely on free psychological support for as long as necessary, based on that individual assessment. They should also be better protected through the availability of protection orders, which is particularly important for those at risk of suffering violence, for example. And child victims should be able to receive bespoke support and protection within the same premises. Together with targeted measures on anti-trafficking and violence against women, we are ensuring gaps are closed and legal protections for victims are comprehensive across the board. So I'm pleased of today's discussions with the ministers. It was the first one, and I look forward to working closely with the Presidency as the file progresses. We try to go as fast as possible to an adoption on such an improvement of the victim rights, and I know that it's also a budgetary challenge for the Department of Justice in all the EU member states to try to increase such a real enforcement of the victims' rights. But it's very important to do that for all the victims of all crimes in the EU. And let me now move to our discussions on Ukraine, because there is a link, of course, with the victims' rights. Our work to support victims of crime takes on even more significance on the context of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Just as our fundamental rights and values are guiding our approach within the Union, the same must go for victims of the atrocities committed by Russia in Ukraine, where those very rights and values are under attack. As I have said before, this means that we must hold to account those who commit war crimes in Ukraine. 16 member states have opened investigations in this regard due to the involvement of some nationals in those situations or due to the universal jurisdiction. And Eurojust continue to play a crucial role in coordinating this work on the international stage. For example, through the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine that we have launched at the beginning of the month, and the Joint Investigation Team. But it also means that victims of these barbaric acts must be properly supported. And I highlighted to ministers today how we are assisting Ukraine on this front. We are continuing to support the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, including in their Victim and Witness Coordination Center, which is working to ensure specialized psychological support. The register of damage facilitated within the Council of Europe will also be a vital resource in documenting the damages, injury and loss suffered by victims of Russia's violations of international law in Ukraine. I'm pleased that I can count on the continued support of Member States as we take our work here forward, because we need to continue not only to bring perpetrators of international crimes before justice, but also to give a real support to the victims of those crimes. And we try to do that in the same way that we try to give a real support to all the victims of all crimes in the EU. As the Minister Llop mentioned, we also exchanged today on improving access to justice across the Union. Central to this is making sure that we embrace digitalization across our justice systems, particularly when it comes to ensuring vulnerable groups are looked after, such as those with disabilities. Our discussions today made clear that much work is already being carried out at the national and European levels on this, notably the political agreement reached last month on the digitalization of justice and access to justice in cross-border matters will make it possible to choose between traditional and digital communication channels, and by allowing remote participation in hearings. But of course, we are looking to do more. Going forward, both our Justice Scoreboard and the recent 2023 Rule of Law report contain many findings and recommendations that will shape our work on the digitalization of justice. I exchanged with ministers on some of these findings here today, and I'm confident that we can work well together to accelerate this important work. And it was very important to pay attention during the meeting today to the children in contact with the justice system, but also to the person with disabilities. And I was very pleased to listen to the good and the best practices in the Member States about the infrastructure and the access for people with disabilities to the judicial infrastructure, but also access to new technologies. And it will be maybe important to try to develop accessibility standards about those new technologies, and certainly when we'll use AI in the justice system, but also about the training of professionals. It was important to listen about the best practices, because we need to train the judge, the prosecutors, maybe the lawyers and other professionals when they have a contact with people with vulnerabilities. And it's important also to try to adapt our procedural rights to be sure that it's possible for all to take advantage of those procedural rights. And the same, of course, I will say it's important to have a permanent consultation with all the civil society and the organizations involved in the protection and the promotion of those rights for people with disabilities or other vulnerable people. Lastly, on the fight against organized crime, this is another area in which we must empower judicial authorities in the face of technological change. With recent legislative developments, the European Union has a well-equipped toolbox to tackle these issues, including through the important role played by Eurojust and the European Public Prosecutor Office. I congratulated ministers on their work on the package on cross-border access to electronic evidence, which was adopted at the end of last month. So after a long journey, it was possible in the EU to have our internal rules on such an access to e-evidence. With these rules, investigators will be able to work more efficiently and bring transnational crime groups to justice more swiftly. We also agree on the need to cripple these groups financially, particularly in light of the challenges posed by invisible transfers in cryptocurrency. The regulations on markets in crypto assets and on transfers of funds adopted in May will help judicial authorities to trace crypto asset transfers and prevent money laundering by organized crime groups, all while ensuring respect for fundamental rights. This area will evolve quickly, of course, and I emphasized the importance, again, of training and exchange of best practices between member states so that we can stay one step ahead of these groups. And of course, it's maybe important to try to attract qualified people in the new technologies and certainly in AI to the public sector. And if we want to do that, it's important to have more attractiveness for those people. Why not at the EU level in some agencies with a real profit for all the member states if we develop such a kind of capabilities at the level of Eurojust, to give an example. While these issues are highly complex, they are essential nonetheless, and I'm grateful to the presidency for ensuring this stays high on the Council agenda. We need to continue to work on all the new technologies that we are facing now and they are also using by the organized crime, but we need also to see how far it's possible to go in the access to data, in the data retention, with a full respect for the fundamental rights. It's all the time the same balance between privacy and security. And you know that we have some rules in the treaty, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but also in some specific legislations about that. So we'll continue the reflections on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Now we can open up the floor to questions. Please say your name and the organization you're representing before you ask your question. And also, please remember that we won't be able to answer any questions about domestic issues today. Any questions?
Gracias. ¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes, Alberto Freile de Televisión.
Good afternoon, Alberto Freire from Spanish television. Commissioner Johansson was saying that the fight against drug trafficking was one that wasn't being won, and I have a question for the Minister and for the Commissioner. We know that cryptocurrencies are used for money laundering by organized crime. Are things being done to improve the situation, or are we falling further and further behind? Thank you. Well, that's right. As Commissioner Reynders said, we do need to have a European answer for this problem, because we know that mafia organizations have very powerful structures supporting them with specialists in technology who then are able to carry out these kind of transactions through informal networks. What we need to do is make sure that we can dismantle those chains that are formed in payments in organized crime. We need to have the right tools to be able to trace payments, see whether money laundering is happening, and then take action to make sure that there isn't impunity for those mafias. They use all kinds of payment services. They use cryptocurrency services such as blockchain to avoid official payment channels. And we need to make sure that people have highly specialized training in our security forces. What we do needs to be very effective in that area, and we need to make sure that our legal system, our judges, also understand what tools are available to be able to properly prosecute these crimes and those mafia which have a cross-border character.
Just to say that we are working very hard on such a kind of evolution in the fight against those kind of organized crimes and organized criminal groups. And I want to say that we have already some regulation. I said in my remarks that we have a regulation on markets in crypto assets since May this year. And since May also we have a new regulation on transfers of funds. So it's possible already now to help the judicial authorities to trace crypto asset transfers and to prevent money laundering by organized crime groups. But of course, it's needed to go further than that. We continue to train all the professionals in such a way, but it's important to do three different things. First of all, I said to attract qualified people in the public sector to work with the judicial authorities, to work with the law enforcement authorities, and maybe in some European agencies, because it's quite difficult to attract very qualified people in all those new technologies in the public sector. The second element is to have a good cooperation between the member states, and I've seen today that the intention is there, the reality is there. There are already some good collaboration and cooperation between the member states, and also a good cooperation between public authorities and private sector. Because, of course, we need to have a real cooperation of the private sector. To give an example, if you have some managers of crypto assets, it's important to have a representative people in the European Union to be in contact with the authorities in the Union. So, you see, we are not starting from scratch. We have already some regulations, we have already some practices, but we need to continue to invest in that in the different ways that I have indicated.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Are there any other questions?
No?
Apparently not. Well, in that case, if there are no further questions, this is the end of the press conference. Thank you all for attending. Thank you.